My husband did something very simple. He talked to people. You're going to be murdered for talking to people. He didn't go after.
Were Erica and Charlie Kirk really getting divorced, and did they file papers just days before his assassination?
A priest that came over to pray over Charlie and Erica's marriage the night before is what I am told.
It wasn't supposed to be found. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because according to online speculation, what surfaced wasn't just a document. It was a timeline breaker. A filing. Quiet. Unpublicized. Allegedly buried in a place no one was looking. And the person who brought it into the light. Not a journalist. Not a lawyer. But someone much closer. Charlie Kirk's sister. And that's when everything changed. Because what she allegedly revealed wasn't just a legal detail. It was a contradiction. One that didn't align with the narrative people thought they understood. A hidden divorce filing. But here's where things get strange. Because the more people looked into it, the less clear it became. Dates didn't match. Statements felt incomplete. And some began asking a question that no one had considered before. If this was hidden, what else hasn't been seen? Because in stories like this, it's never just one document. It's what that document connects to. Before the document. Before the alleged filing. Before the sudden flood of theories. There was already a narrative in place. Stable. Familiar. Unquestioned. At the center of it, Charlie Kirk. A public figure with a consistent presence, a defined voice, and a life that, at least outwardly, seemed structured and transparent. But behind every public narrative, there are layers. And sometimes, those layers don't surface until something disrupts the timeline. And that's exactly what happened. Because according to online discussions, the first sign wasn't the filing itself. It was a mention. A small reference. Something said casually, almost too casually, by someone who wasn't expected to say anything at all. Charlie's sister. Not a regular public voice. Not someone constantly in front of cameras. Which is why what she allegedly revealed felt different. Unfiltered. Unmanaged. But here's where things get strange. Because at first, no one noticed. The comment didn't go viral immediately. It didn't trigger headlines. It just sat there. Until someone connected it to something else. A record. An entry. A filing that, according to some online speculation, shouldn't have existed in the way it did. Because when people started looking deeper, they found references. Not a full document. Not a complete case. But fragments. Database entries. Legal terminology. Clues that pointed to something bigger. And that's when everything shifted. Because suddenly, the timeline people believed in didn't fully align. A relationship that appeared stable now had questions around it. Events that seemed straightforward now felt incomplete. And that's what made this moment different. Because it wasn't about a public statement. It was about a private action. Something that allegedly happened outside the spotlight, but had the power to change everything inside it. Meanwhile, conversations began to form. Not in mainstream spaces, but in smaller circles. Forums. Comment threads. Communities where people analyze details others overlook. And slowly, patterns emerged. Questions about timing. Questions about why certain things weren't disclosed. Questions about whether the public narrative had been simplified or selectively presented. And that's when the idea of a hidden filing took hold. Not confirmed. Not verified. But persistent. Because once a possibility like that enters the conversation, it doesn't go away. It grows. And then the reactions began. Clips resurfacing. Old statements reanalyzed. People looking back at moments that once seemed normal, now asking, what were we missing? And that's when the story stops being about a single document. It becomes about the gaps. The spaces between what was known and what might have been left out. Because in stories like this, the gaps are where everything happens. And once you start looking into them, you can't stop. The moment people started looking for the filing, everything escalated. Not because it was confirmed, but because it might exist. And in situations like this, possibility is enough. It began with a screenshot. Blurry. Cropped. Circulating in small circles before spreading wider. Allegedly showing a partial database entry. No full names. No complete case number. Just fragments. A date. A classification. And one word that caught everyone's attention. Dissolution. That was the moment everything shifted. Because suddenly, this wasn't just speculation. It looked like evidence. But here's where things get strange. Because no one could verify it. The screenshot had no source. No official link. No way to confirm whether it was real, altered, or taken out of context. And yet, it spread. Fast. Because it fit the narrative people were already building. And that's how these stories grow. Not from certainty, but from alignment. And then, another piece surfaced. This time, a message. Allegedly from someone familiar with legal processes. Again, unverified. But detailed enough to feel real. It read, not all filings are meant to be visible immediately. Timing matters. Timing. That word keeps coming up. Because if timing is controlled, then visibility is controlled. And if visibility is controlled, then perception is shaped. And that's when the narrative deepens. Because now, this isn't just about whether a filing exists. It's about when it was meant to be seen. And by who. Meanwhile, people begin re-examining everything. Old appearances. Public statements. Moments that once seemed unrelated. Now viewed through a different lens. And that lens, it changes everything. Because once you believe something might have been hidden, every detail feels like a clue. A user claims, go back to that interview. Look at the timing. Another says, the gap between those events doesn't make sense anymore. And then, the timeline becomes unstable. Because when you start mapping events against the alleged filing, things don't align perfectly. Not dramatically, but enough to raise questions. And that's when the voice notes appear. Again, distorted, unconfirmed, but widely shared before disappearing. In one, a voice allegedly says, it wasn't hidden. It was just not meant to be connected. That line changes everything. Because it suggests something subtle. Not concealment, but separation. That the information existed, but wasn't meant to be linked to the public narrative. And that's a very different idea. Because it implies structure. Design. A way of presenting information. Without revealing the full picture. But here's the unsettling part. Because even this doesn't confirm anything. It just adds another layer. Another possibility. Another angle that feels real, but can't be proven. And that's what makes this so volatile. Because the more layers you add, the harder it becomes to find the center. And right now, there is no clear center. Just fragments, screenshots, messages, voice notes, all pointing in similar directions, but none fully verified. And yet, the story grows. Because once people believe something might be missing, they don't stop looking. And when they keep looking, they start finding more patterns, connections, details that feel significant, even if they can't be confirmed. And that's where the tension builds. Because now, this isn't just about a filing. It's about what that filing represents. A shift in understanding, in perception, in how the story has been told. And that's what makes it powerful. Because if even part of this is true, then the narrative people have been following is incomplete. But if it's not, then the entire situation becomes something else. A story built on interpretation, amplified by speculation. And that's just as unsettling. Because now, you're not choosing between truth and falsehood. You're choosing between possibilities. And none of them are fully confirmed. Which creates something dangerous. Uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads faster than facts, stronger than evidence, and harder to contain. And that's where the escalation begins. Because what comes next doesn't clarify anything. It complicates everything. At this point, you would expect clarity, a confirmation, a denial, something solid. But instead, everything becomes more unstable. Because the deeper people dig into the alleged filing, the less it fits into a clean narrative. And that's when the contradictions begin. It starts with dates. Again. But this time, people go deeper. They compare public appearances, statements, travel timelines, and align them against the alleged filing window. And according to some online interpretations, something doesn't line up. Not dramatically, but enough to make you pause. An event that appears too close. A statement that feels slightly out of sync. Almost like two timelines are overlapping. But not perfectly. And that raises a disturbing question. Was the public timeline always incomplete? Or are people forcing connections that aren't there? But here's where things get strange. Because just as that question begins to spread, another document surfaces. More detailed than the first. Still unverified. But clearer. It appears to show a case classification. And a partial filing sequence. No names visible. But the structure. Convincing. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because when something looks official, it feels real. Even if it isn't confirmed. And then, a new claim. Circulating across multiple platforms. Allegedly from someone familiar with legal filings. It reads, "Not all dissolutions are public immediately. Some are processed differently." That line spreads fast. Because it introduces a new possibility. That what people are seeing is only part of the process. And that there may be more. Not yet visible. Which raises the stakes. Because now, this isn't just about what's been found. It's about what hasn't been seen yet. Meanwhile, the focus shifts back to Charlie. Because if a filing exists, then its implications extend beyond just the document. They affect everything connected to it. Relationships, decisions, public narratives. And that's when people start asking, if this was happening, why didn't we know? And that question doesn't have a clear answer. Because in situations like this, information doesn't always move evenly. Some details surface, others don't. Some are highlighted, others are ignored. And that creates gaps. Gaps that people try to fill. And when they fill those gaps, they create narratives. But here's the unsettling part. Because those narratives aren't always accurate. They are interpretations, built on incomplete information. And yet, they feel real. Because they connect. They align. They make sense. Until they don't. And that's where the escalation intensifies. Because now, two competing explanations begin to form. One side believes this is a real filing, a detail that changes everything, proof that the public narrative has been incomplete. The other side argues this is misinterpretation, fragments taken out of context, a story built on assumptions. And both sides sound convincing, which creates something volatile. Because when two opposing ideas both feel plausible, certainty disappears. And that's exactly what happens. Because now, every new piece of information is questioned. Every leak is analyzed. Every detail is reinterpreted. And nothing feels stable. And then, the final escalation. A claim. Unverified. But spreading rapidly. Suggesting that more documents may exist. Not yet surfaced. Not yet discussed. But potentially significant. And that changes everything. Because now, this isn't just about what's already been found. It's about what might still come out. And that creates tension. Because unresolved stories don't settle. They build. And right now, everything feels like it's building toward something. But what? That's the question no one can answer. Because at this stage, nothing is resolved. Not the filing. Not the timeline. Not even the meaning behind it. Everything feels suspended. Uncertain. And that's where the breaking point begins. Because when too many contradictions exist, something has to give. And what gives is certainty. By now, it feels like the story is about the filing. The screenshots. The dates. The inconsistencies. But what if that's not the real story? What if the filing isn't the twist? It's the distraction. Because a new perspective begins to emerge. Quiet at first. Then impossible to ignore. Not from an insider. Not from a leak. But from analysts who study how narratives form online. And according to their breakdown, the most important moment wasn't when the filing appeared. It was when people started connecting it. Let that sink in. Because it changes everything. According to this theory, the filing, whether real or not, was incomplete. A fragment. And fragments don't tell stories. People do. But here's where things get strange. Because when people connected that fragment, they didn't just interpret it. They expanded it. They built timelines around it. Attached it to unrelated events. Gave it meaning that may not have been there originally. And once that process started, it became unstoppable. Because every new connection made the story feel stronger. More real. More complete. Even if the original fragment never changed. And that's the twist. Because now, the question isn't just, is the filing real? It becomes, is the story built around it accurate? And those are two very different things. Meanwhile, the role of Charlie's sister shifts. Because her alleged mention wasn't a full explanation. It was a trigger. A starting point. Something that caused people to look deeper. But not necessarily in the right direction. And that's what makes it unsettling. Because once a story begins from a trigger, it doesn't always follow a straight path. It branches into possibilities, into interpretations, into narratives that feel connected, even when they might not be. And then, another realization. One that changes everything again. Because when people go back to the original comment, to the moment this all started, they notice something. It wasn't definitive. It wasn't framed as a revelation. It was subtle, almost casual. Which raises a critical question. Did the significance come from the comment itself? Or from everything that happened after? Because if the meaning was created afterward, then the story we are seeing isn't the original story. It's the evolved version. Built through reactions, through repetition, through interpretation layered on top of interpretation. And that's powerful. Because it means the narrative has taken on a life of its own, independent of its source. But here's the unsettling part. Because this doesn't disprove anything. The filing could still exist. The timeline could still be incomplete. The gaps could still be real. But now, everything is filtered through a different lens. A lens that questions not just the information, but the way it's being understood. And once that lens is in place, nothing feels certain. Because now, every detail could be significant or misinterpreted. Every connection could be meaningful or coincidental. And there's no clear way to separate them. Which leads to one unavoidable conclusion. The story has outgrown its origin. And once that happens, it doesn't resolve. It evolves. And that evolution is where everything begins to collapse. Once that realization took hold, the story didn't end. It fractured. Because when people stopped focusing on the filing itself and started questioning the narrative built around it, everything began to break. Not loudly, not instantly, but in layers. Because now, there wasn't one version of the story anymore. There were many. Some insisted the filing was real. A hidden detail that changes everything about the timeline. Others argued it was misinterpreted. A fragment turned into something bigger than it ever was. And then there were those caught in between. Unsure. Because both sides sounded convincing. And that's where chaos begins. But here's where things get strange. Because as the debate intensified, the information itself started shifting. Again, screenshots that were once widely shared disappeared. Threads discussing them locked or buried. New versions surfaced, edited differently. Different clarity, different framing. Almost like the same piece of evidence was being told in multiple ways at once. And that only made things worse. Because when information isn't consistent, people don't assume randomness. They assume intent, even if none is confirmed. Meanwhile, the role of Charlie's sister becomes more unclear. Some believe she revealed something significant. Others believe her words were taken out of context, amplified, transformed into something they were never meant to be. And again, no confirmation, just interpretation. And that's the problem. Because once interpretation replaces certainty, everything becomes unstable. Then, the evidence itself, those fragments that started everything, people begin questioning them more aggressively. Where did they come from? Why were they incomplete? Why did they spread so fast and disappear just as quickly? And for the first time, the focus shifts away from what they suggest to whether they should be trusted at all. And that's when the collapse becomes complete. Because once trust breaks, everything else follows. The claims, the connections, the conclusions, all of it becomes fragile. And what remains is uncertainty. Not chaotic, structured, lingering, unresolved. Because now, there isn't one narrative. There are multiple. All incomplete. All competing. All impossible to fully verify. And that's where we are. Not at an ending, but at a standstill. A moment where the story no longer moves forward clearly. It just exists. Fragmented. Still evolving. And that leads to one final question. If everything has collapsed into uncertainty, then what are we actually left with? So what did we actually uncover? A hidden filing? A misunderstood timeline? Or something far more unsettling? A story that changed the moment people tried to understand it. Because when you step back, nothing here is fixed. Charlie Kirk, at the center of it all, yet no longer able to clarify. His sister, allegedly the source of the first spark, but never fully explaining it. And the audience, trying to assemble a narrative from fragments that refuse to fully connect. And that's the unsettling part. Because every version of this story feels possible. Was there really a hidden filing? Or did a small, incomplete detail grow into something much bigger through interpretation? Were the inconsistencies meaningful? Or simply the result of missing context? And most importantly, how much of what you believe about this situation comes from what actually happened? And how much comes from everything that followed? Because once a narrative starts moving, it doesn't stay the same. It evolves. Through clips. Through discussions. Through repeated interpretations that slowly reshape the original moment. Until the truth, whatever it was, becomes harder to recognize. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the most powerful stories aren't the ones that give you answers. They are the ones that leave you questioning everything. So now it's your turn. Go back. Look at the fragments again. Not just what they show, but what they don't show. Because whatever really happened here, it didn't end with that filing. It's still unfolding. Quietly. And the next piece might already be out there, waiting for you to notice.